And I just want to say a quick word, the same quick word I said the last time about this series. And that quick word is the way that I thought I could best honor our stellar faculty at SKC was to do a lecture series where they could showcase their talents. So we had Professor Frank Stomp last week. Thank you so much for being the first one, Professor Stomp. He was the talk of the town for a good week, probably be the talk of the town for a lot longer. So the idea is to acquaint people at SKC with people at SKC. We don't always know what each other is doing. And then as well invite the larger community to come and meet our faculty at SKC because they are indeed stellar scholars. So the honor of professor. I want to say a word about the word professor. To me, a professor is a teacher, a researcher, a mentor. Professor is a very academic term. It's a term of respect. It is a well-earned, well-deserved status. And so you are hearing the professors from Salish Kootenai College. It's someone who has earned the respect of their colleagues as well as the larger academic community. So introducing our professor for the day, Professor Swaney's bio. He instructs us that he earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in wildlife biology from the University of Montana and also worked for the tribes here for 15 years. His professional experiences include wildlife biologist and environmental protection division manager. Professor Swaney is the head of natural resources. However, he also lets us know in his spare time he likes to bowl. He is an avid angler, and I know he likes to play Scrabble. Yeah, I think I beat you the last time. Anyway, something for you to try to attain. So his presentation today is going to explore the history of Flathead Lake management efforts and desired future conditions from the perspective of creating a system containing a higher prevalence of native fish species. I know that he has a very keen interest in wildlife biology from a very early age. He was very fortunate to be raised in a family that made sure he spent most of his time outdoors. And then as well, I also know he was heavily influenced by his neighbors, Dave and Peg Harriman. Many of you may remember Dave and Peg. They were well-known environmentalists, probably early environmentalists, and they influenced many of us in the Mission Valley. As a mentor, Professor Swaney asks his students to work hard. I hope we all ask our students to work hard and to believe in themselves. A good professor is also very passionate about their work, and that's something that Professor Swaney brings, is a passion about his work. He is not only passionate, I know he is intellectually curious, an environmentalist, a mentor, a good teacher, a researcher, a colleague, and a friend. So help me welcome Professor Bill Swaney.
Thank you, Luana. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm going to try to be worth all of that. Wow, that's quite a build-up. When I was first asked to do this, actually, I had the fortune of walking into the Mysis building, the A. Mysis building, where President Ross's office is, and her administrative assistant informed me that I was going to be giving a talk and just told me to select the day and pick a topic, and so there we have it. But needless to say, it didn't take me very long to decide on what it was that I wanted to talk about. And I have a strong interest in the field of ecology, I think. I consider myself an organismal person in that there's a lot of people who do molecular ecology and cellular biology and those kinds of things. And that's not where my interest is. My interest is in systems and in organisms as they interact with their environment. And so I think that's one of the things that really struck me about this whole process. And I was, of course, wanting some sort of a hook, and I'm so glad that my colleague, Dr. Adrian Leighton, is here because he gave me the alternate title to the talk, which would be of Mysis and Men. And I have to acknowledge him for that for that alternate title. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time exploring a little bit of the cultural history of the area. We're going to talk a little bit about early European management. We're going to talk about contemporary management, where we are with lake trout, some of the recent efforts to address a situation that I'm going to try to unfold for you as we go along here. And I was concerned at first about not having enough slides, and I'm probably going to be more concerned about not having enough time. Because as you all know, we are programmed for about an hour and 20 minutes, so I will do my best to stay within the allotted time. I do have a meeting in Missoula at 2:30 as well, so hopefully that will help keep me on task. But again, thank you all for being here today. Appreciate people's interest. I know there's maybe one or two indentured servants that had to show up on school. I recognize some of my students, and I appreciate the students that are here today as well. So again, thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it. Try to make it worth your while. So basically, there's a lot of interest in the management of Flathead Lake. It's a very large, attractive resource to the area. And one of the things that I became aware of through the course of my education was just the idea of how much Flathead Lake has changed over the years. And primarily it's changed because we as managers have intentionally introduced elements to that ecosystem. And when we did so, we did not realize what the impacts were going to be. So there were some well-intentioned ideas, there were some well-intentioned thoughts, I think, that were out there in terms of what people wanted to accomplish. But like a lot of things, we didn't know the things that we know now. So when we made some of these changes, it resulted in some unanticipated results. And what we're going to do is just run through the history and where we are today, and just a little bit of where we can possibly go in the future with the issue of Flathead Lake management. So in terms of the basics, a lot of people may know this, they may not know this. I grew up with a family. My mother's family had a place on Skidoo Bay, and my sister's here. She'll remember that we used to go up for family reunions in the summertime, and at the top of the hill there at Polson, where the scenic turnout is, there were a lot of people that would be there taking pictures. And I'd always go, what are they doing? It's just a lake. It's just a lake. Well, it's in fact the largest freshwater lake in the lower 48 west of the Great Lakes, actually. It's quite large. It has an extensive surface area, an extensive watershed area. And in recent years, there's also been a number of people that have moved into the area, and that has a bearing on lake management as well, both in terms of the recreational pressure associated with it, as well as human influences with regard to introduction of nutrients and other pollutants. So it's quite long, nearly 28 miles long, about 15 miles wide at the widest point, about 117 meters, which is 386 feet, which is about right there, actually, is about what they call mid-lake deep. And so it is quite a deep lake. It's the average depth is about 44 meters, but this entire South Bay, as you can see here, is 20 feet or less. So it's pretty interesting. It's quite shallow in the south end, and yet it's very, very deep at certain places in the lake, nearly 400 feet at the deepest place. It's classified as an oligotrophic lake, and what that means essentially is that it is a lake that is naturally low in nutrients. It's normally clear and fairly cold, and has a relatively sparse biological population. My dad used to say, it's a oligotrophic lake. He said that means it's a biological desert. That's what he used to say. But that's not quite the case. An oligotrophic system is naturally low in productivity, and that's an important point in all of this. So therefore, over the course of time, Flathead Lake has evolved to be a system in its natural state, pre-European contact. It was a system that had evolved with species that were adapted to these exact kinds of conditions: clean, clear, cold, deep water, low nutrient concentrations. And this is everything from the little itty-bitty tiny critters to the largest organisms at the upper trophic levels. So this is the system as it evolved prior to European contact. Of course, in terms of historical overview, it was very significant to the people of this area, both in terms of inhabiting the area, utilizing resources along the lake shore, within the lake itself. Numerous accounts of activities such as this gathering of what our people referred to as tules or bulrushes to make tule mats for teepees, to utilizing the fish resources, particularly in this area here. One of the things that's always been interesting to me, and the importance, I think, of some of the things like what Julie is working on in terms of place name projects, and what other people are working on in terms of place name projects. This area of the sort of the west arm of the lake, and then more particularly this area of Dayton Creek, which used to be known as Fish Trap Creek. And you can kind of see here where this was the old highway, this is the new highway now. But the way this has all been bermed up and kind of created sort of an artificial water table right in here, and has probably had quite a bit of effect as much as anything else, as well as the adjacent upland land use practices. But this area was so prevalent with spawning fish species in historic times that the Kootenai people referred to it as Fish Trap Days. I was just thinking of Buddy, as Fish Trap Creek. And the structures such as this would have been utilized and placed in the stream to capture spawning runs. And those were most likely could have been West Slope cutthroat. They could have been bull trout. I don't know exactly what species those could have been. But the fact of the matter is those species don't exist anymore, or those large runs of fish don't exist anymore. And Dayton Creek in contemporary times has been an area where the Tribal Fisheries Program and some of the other folks have done quite a bit of restoration work to try to restore that creek and the surrounding upland area. So that place name tells us something significant about the change in the landscape that's occurred post contact with Europeans. Some of the other evidence that we know of that's extremely important, how important this area was, is areas that contain painted rocks, for example, and those other important aspects that showed how important the lake shore was to our people, where these kinds of sites exist. There are sites where along the historic old high water mark, the low water mark, there are places where artifacts are commonly found. So, if we've been inhabitants of this area since time immemorial, then obviously this place contains a great deal of significance to us. And we see that by evidence of things like Fish Trap Creek and the cultural artifacts and sites that are present along the lake shore. So it's a very, very, very important area. Now, in terms of European management, our frame of reference here, I think, really should be the era of allotment and homesteading, because when we look at that particular period of time, and we all should be familiar with the approximate dates, but in one of the things that really struck me in looking at the history of Flathead Lake and the introduction of species to the lake, the first species that was documented to be introduced into the lake occurred in 1890, and that was 2 years after the Dawes Act, 3 years after the Dawes Act, but before the reservation had been open to homesteading. And we also have to recall here that we only own half of the lake. We own the south half, and I always like to say it's not the lower half, it's the south half. So, but we see the sequence of events here that became very, very significant to us that occurred a very long time ago. 1890, 1898, largemouth bass, 1905, lake trout were introduced, and this is a significant date for us here in terms of this is when this species was introduced. And it was common practice in those days for European managers to decide that lake trout would be a viable commercial fishery, such as it was in other areas. So they saw a large oligotrophic system. Lake trout are adapted to oligotrophic lakes, but they were not normally present in this particular region. So they were introduced here in 1905. Then 1910, concurrent with the opening of the reservation, we see the introduction of 3 more species, and then yet another species in 1913, another species in 1914, and up until recent times, even in the 1960s, there was an introduction of northern pike, which is said to be quote, illegal. And I think from a certain perspective, one could argue that all of these introductions from the tribe's perspective were illegal because they were certainly, I don't think they were sanctioned. But it's also possible that these took place upstream as well off the reservation and those fish invaded this area. So this is a prevalence of introduced species that have been brought to this system, and there have been some well-intentioned introductions, and the last one would be kokanee salmon. And salmon were fairly important for a long period of time, from about shortly after their period of introduction to about the mid-1980s. And they were a very, very popular fishery. I can recall that tribal members were allowed to snag salmon, but no one else was. You could fish for them, but tribal members, when they were spawning along the lakeshore, we would be able to go out and snag salmon. There were those little sockeye salmon, kokanee, but little red little buggers when they were all colored up and ready to spawn. And I don't know, Roger, did you ever do anything like that? Yeah. So a number of tribal members would go out and they would make use of the salmon. It was a very, very popular fishery, a sport fishery in the mid-1980s. I used to fly over Skidoo Bay when the crescent of ice would form inside the bay, and there would be 400 or 500 ice fishermen out there fishing for kokanee. And Buddy, you probably remember the popularity of the kokanee sport fishery in those days. So it was something that was really attractive to people, that there was a lot of use of that as a recreational fishery. So kokanee salmon were introduced and became a very, very popular item, and indeed, like many introduced species have, became a focus of management efforts. Wow, we have this popular fish species and people like to use them, so let's see what we can do with this. Now, in terms of contemporary management, however, from a certain perspective, what happened with the introduction of all these species was that the native species started to be impacted. In particular, the bull trout populations have showed historic declines. In fact, there was a group that was established that specifically concluded that lake trout were one of the primary causes of the decline of bull trout. So much so that these are the kinds of numbers that they were talking about. They were talking about as many as 30,000 fish in 1 year, 2006, being predated by lake trout. So a significant source of mortality. Another issue with the bull trout was also introductions of other species causing sterile hybridization. The first generation hybrids in this case would be sterile, and so that would basically be an evolutionary dead end for that segment of the population, and they would be lost to the gene pool. So we have those kinds of issues. So not just outright death, but also hybridization was a problem, among other things as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now I want to take a step back from this for a minute and talk just a little bit about, I think, some of the things that some of my students are going to go, God, here he goes again. We're going to hear this over and over and over. But first of all, I think what we need to keep in mind is good management mimics natural processes. Those are the kinds of things that we should strive for. I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm saying that good management should mimic natural processes. That's one of the things that we would hope for. Another thing that I stress to my students over and over is to know the biology of the organisms that you manage, those that you study. It may seem like a circular logic sort of thing, but if you need to know about lake trout, then you need to understand their biology. If you need to know about some other organism, then you need to know their biology. And there are numerous reasons why we would do that and why it would benefit us. Another thing that hopefully every student that I have here in the audience today would be able to define an ecosystem as an area where the living and the non-living interact together. That's a really simple definition. Everything that's alive, everything that's not alive interacting together in some given area. I think we can all understand that. But yet there are people who aspire to the concept of ecosystem management, and they throw that around as though it's very simple to do. and yet it's not simple to do. It's easy to conceptualize it within a few words, but it's very, very difficult to manage an ecosystem properly because it implies that you understand all of these really, really, really complex interactions. And, you know, we like to say, we sort of stand in class, I do, and I say, with this we know all things are connected. But it is really, really true. And in terms of as our understandings of the natural world have unfolded and how we see natural systems and how they function and how they're structured, we see this incredible amount of complexity that we can barely comprehend at times, the amazing complexity of it. And last of all, we'll give a nod to, Jurassic Park and what's his name, Jeff? Jeff, yeah. We see, basically what he was talking about was chaos theory, or what is also known as the butterfly effect or the butterfly principle, which basically implies a sensitive dependence upon initial conditions, which is to say that if you start at a certain place and if you even modify slightly that set of conditions, you can end up completely somewhere where you did not intend to be. And I think that this is the kind of case where very clearly something that seemed to be an insignificant action had majorly significant results. So it's something that we think of as chaos theory or the butterfly effect. And this is just kind of an example of what we're talking about here. This is a simplified representation of an aquatic food web. I had a really good one, but I was still putting this together at 11 o'clock, and I couldn't find the one that I wanted to use. But this is a simplified representation of an aquatic food web. Remember when we were students in school, in grade school or whatever, we learned about the food chain, and it was the grass, and then the cow, and then you, and then everything was nice and linear? Well, we now understand that there are all these interconnected components of an ecosystem. And remember I said, just all the living and all the non-living interacting together in some given area. Here's some of the non-living stuff. Here's some more of the living stuff. And here's this first trophic level of all of these organisms that feed on vegetation. And some of these arrows are going to represent to us some things that are really important, and those are interactions between organisms. Those interactions we can characterize as either relatively weak or very strong. And these strong interactions, if we are not aware of which ones they are, and we monkey with those really strong interactions, then we end up with something completely different. But it's incumbent upon us to understand, in this case, for example, some sort of benthic invertebrate and the strength of its relationship, for example, to a fish species in this case. And I think that's kind of where we went wrong with some of the things that we did with Flathead Lake, was we did not fathom the complexity of the aquatic system, and aquatic systems are even more complex than terrestrial systems are. In a terrestrial system, you might have the grass, and then the stuff that eats the grass, and then the stuff that eats the stuff that eats the grass, and you might have one more level or not. In an aquatic system, you can have 3, 4, 5 levels like that, where you have like the great whites or whatever in the ocean, and then you have, leopard seals that great whites eat, and the great whites eat everything else too, and then the leopard seals eat the penguins, and the penguins eat the fish. But you see those levels that we have in these aquatic systems. So we have these multiple levels of complexity in an aquatic system, and we really, in order to manage that, we need to understand the strength of how certain components interact here. This is just another example of another aquatic introduction that I've used as an example in my classes. This is related to, I believe, Lake Victoria and several other lakes in Africa, were some of the largest freshwater lakes in the world, where they decided to introduce a piscivorous fish, the Nile perch. And we're not talking about those cute little buggers that we catch here that get to be about a pound. We're talking about 6 foot long, 200-pound fish is what they grow to be. These are huge fish. They're very, very fish eating. Lake Victoria in particular probably had 300 to 500 species of these little cichlids, these little colorful fish that probably originated in one of those lakes. and then speciated out from there. And it was considered to be one of the most significant single event extinctions in our recorded history, when the Nile perch came in and wiped out a whole bunch of native fishes. There were other associated effects with that some of my students that were in zoology might remember. These were really oily fish. They had to be smoked when they were caught, so it resulted in deforestation, which resulted in water quality problems in the lake as well. And then these other fish were algae eaters, and so when they were all killed off, the algae bloomed and then died, and then we had oxygen problems. So it's an example of all of these complex interactions that took place. And when we modified that, it completely altered the system from a very complex one with multiple interactions to one that was greatly simplified. One of our concerns there is that diversity generally equals stability. If we don't have diversity and then we have only a few interactions, if we start monkeying with those interactions, then we could potentially run into problems. That's why we like to have multiple species in an area, or multiple stands of trees if we're going to manage trees or something along that line. So I'll tip my hat to Bruce Lee today, and we'll say enter the Mysis. So this was the system as it occurred, and we had introduced all these fish. We had a starting set of native species that we had, and those were primarily bull trout, West Slope cutthroat. The largest species that was documented historically was the peamouth chub. We'll get to some of that information in a little bit. But we had these native fish species, and then we introduced fish species. And because of the popularity of kokanee, and because of an erroneous interpretation of data on the part of other managers in other areas, they basically said, wow, look, we introduced Mysis and it worked really well, and the kokanee did really well. Guess what? They were wrong. They interpreted the data wrong. And it was thought that Mysis shrimp, these little tiny swimming animals, would be a good food source for kokanee in the lake. And the kokanee would have more to eat, and then we'd have more kokanee, and everyone could catch more fish. They were wrong about all that. But one of the things I learned in the course of doing this was I had always assumed that Mysis shrimp were put in Flathead Lake. They were not. They were introduced upstream. They were introduced in 5 lakes north of the lake. And they found their way into Flathead Lake, and that is where the problem began. But they were introduced because people wanted to manage the kokanee population, and a huge segment of the kokanee population was in Flathead Lake. So this introduction occurred, and the shrimp moved downstream, and what happened was there was a belief that the mysis would be a food resource for young kokanee. And again, this is why I just preach this over and over. You understand the biology of the species that you manage. During the day, here's the young kokanee at the surface. During the day, here are the mysis shrimp. They're on the bottom. And then as daylight changes to darkness, they go like this. And the shrimp come to the top, and the young kokanee go to the bottom. And so they were never available, was what happened. The young kokanee never had that food source available to them because they just did not occupy the same place and time. And the other thing that happened was the young kokanee were here, the mysis shrimp were down here. The mysis were eating everything in sight on the bottom. And they were basically stripping the bottom of any food resource available to particularly the youngest segment of kokanee. So that's what happened. They essentially starved those young kokanee out. So what happened was it was the exact opposite effect of what was intended. And that was only the beginning. Because the young kokanee were being starved out, that was one negative effect. The other negative effect was lake trout were able to exploit this new food resource like it was intended for kokanee. But the lake trout didn't, it wasn't check your ID at the door. They said, hey, we're going to eat these mysis shrimp. They're just as good for us as anything else is. So lake trout became very good, at preying on Mysis shrimp, and then the lake trout population took off. That's what happened. Okay, so big deal. Well, this is a conceptual representation of what we're talking about. This is a paper. What I'm talking about here is a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I have about 15 copies of it up here if anyone would like to see it. And this is a representation of the food web in the lake with relative abundances. Here's our peamouth chub times 2, so this size would be roughly twice the size. Now again, these data are dependent upon what the capture methods that Morton Elrod and another fellow used in 1915 and 16. And whatever capture methods they used, and then they quantified what was happening with respect to the fish and the insects, the microorganisms in the lake. We had these copepods, and we had cladocerans, which are water fleas, and then these little rotifers. So the lake at that time, according to the techniques they used, was dominated by peamouth chub, which was a native, by the northern pike minnow, which is another native. Here represents our bull trout abundance. Here's our west slope cutthroat trout abundance. There were 2 species of suckers, long-nosed suckers and large-scale suckers, just represented as a single S here. And then the mountain whitefish, which is a native whitefish species. And so that was roughly a representation of what the aquatic system looked like shortly after the turn of the century. And then the period of about 1981 to 1983, roughly the sort of the dominant period of kokanee, where we see the kokanee salmon population, again represented by 2 times. The true size of the population would be about twice that figure. And then we start to see reductions here, reductions there in the bull trout, and then we start to see the emergence of lake whitefish, Lake Superior whitefish, which had been introduced. And although I noticed that for some reason they were introduced in 1890, but they were not represented in the sample from 1915 and 16. Nor was there any mention of white sturgeon, and I can't figure out why that is. Because it's always been my assumption that there were sturgeon in the lake, but I can't find any mention of it in any of the management plans or anything. So we also see the emergence of yellow perch and the lake trout in this representation. And now this is where we are. Okay? So here is the Lake Superior whitefish, again represented as being only half the size of what it represents to the population. I've heard the fisheries biologists say that probably 80% of the lake 80% of the biomass is represented by lake whitefish. And here are the lake trout, here's the bull trout, and the other species, and also our good friend, the mysis. Okay, so let's look at this in composite then. And what we see is a shift in species composition from being dominated by these natives here, the peamouth chub, northern pike minnow, we see decline. This is the peamouth chub as it exists today. Pike minnows sort of went down, then started to come back up. We can see bull trout numbers sort of were stable, and now they've declined some. Mountain whitefish may be doing okay, but we're starting to see just a dramatic shift in species composition overall. And I just can't emphasize again that 80% of the biomass is thought to be Lake Superior whitefish now, which is, it's just amazing to think of how much this aquatic system has changed from what it was historically in a relatively short amount of time. Speaking of time, how am I doing on time?
You're okay.
Okay. And I don't know if you've noticed, but our Mysis shrimp are lurking everywhere in the background. This is my theme, is the Mysis are lurking everywhere in the background. So what do we want to do? How do we get away from sort of this scenario where we are here to something that's a little more balanced? And I think that's the goal of current management, is to recognize, number one, the shift in species composition that occurred, and then say, what can we do about this, or what should our goals be? And this is, I think, where there's a lot of controversy. First of all, we have co-management. And in co-management, we cannot make any progress by drawing lines in the sand. And actually, my sister was here, who's here. She served on an advisory board that drafted the initial lake trout management plan. They met in the late 90s and had additional public involvement in this process. And it is controversial. There's no doubt about it. This is controversial. And they drafted a management plan for the 10-year period of 2001 to 10 and set some goals. And during that process as well, they reviewed the plan in 2006 to see where they were and if their goals were still going to be the same and if they needed to change anything. And so they did that, underwent a 5-year review. But the bottom line was the decision was made to try to reduce the lake trout population. Again, this is something that's controversial. It is very controversial to some people. One of the controversial components of it, and the fisheries folks told me that some of their colleagues laughed at them. They said, we're going to try to use recreational anglers. They're like, you can't do that. Well, we could do what they're doing in Yellowstone Lake. They were doing 24-hour gill netting. They were paying their fisheries managers not to manage fish, but to go kill fish. And they were doing gill netting around the clock. They reviewed all kinds of possibilities. They even looked at a strategy. I'd love to see how this works. They called them Judas fish. They were going to monitor some Judas fish. And I don't know whether it was like they were supposed to lead them to where the rest of the lake trout were, and then they blow up or what, I don't know. But they talked about Judas fish, and they talked about introducing, get this, they talked about introducing sea lampreys to Yellowstone Lake. Sterile sea lampreys, which nearly wiped out the lake trout in the Great Lakes. But again, people were putting these ideas up. Let's add another exotic component to the system. Maybe that'll help. Or to introduce somehow sterile males to the population, sterile male lake trout to the population, so that would be sort of fake breeding, so to speak. So anyway, so in Yellowstone Lake, they went through all kinds, and we're talking about a lake in the national park. Yes, the lake in Yellowstone National Park. They've had a lake trout population, and I believe they've removed 450,000 lake trout from Yellowstone Lake, and they're still doing it. They're still doing it there. They're doing it in Coeur d'Alene Lake. Lake trout are established in places where they're causing problems. So, what are we going to do about it? That's part of the question. So the decision was made, let's reduce this lake trout population. Okay? So I think the limits were 15, something like that. And this was before, and I gotta give Buddy credit. Buddy's got a lot of ideas. Buddy Papin's here today, and he was the one, I sort of have to give him the credit and I have to give him the blame, because he came up with this idea. And this idea was called Fish Trap Days. And this was in 2002, and I went, you know what? I've never fished on the lake. I've hardly ever fished on the lake, seriously. And they had Fish Trap Days, and it was concurrent with Elmo Powwow, and it was a one-weekend thing. And I went out there, and I got a sunburn for 2 days. And being an intellectual, I read the stuff, and I went to the Mack man, and I asked him what to do, and I read his stuff, and I went and I bought the hooks and everything, and I got a sunburn was what I got. And but I persisted. And in those days, about the time of the start of the Fish Trap Days, the very first Mack Days, the limit was 20 per day, and that's pretty liberal. That's a pretty darn generous limit on fish. For example, if you did smallmouth bass in the river, it's 5 a day. And I think they have to be a certain size, 12 inches or something like that. That limit has since been raised to 50. And there nowhere in the United States is there this kind of a limit. I haven't researched this, but I guarantee you that there is not this kind of limit anywhere in the United States. And it gets better. It may be 100. By the time the Mack Day starts, which it starts exactly 4 weeks from today, the limit may be 100. It may be 100. The state is considering, they presently have it in their regulations to consider raising the limit to 100 fish per day. Now, I've caught 50 in a day a few times, and that's a lot of work. So I can't fathom 100. But Some people ask, why have a limit? And some of you may be asking that same question. At any rate, right now what we'll say is they're considering raising the limit to 100 per day. So again, in terms of understanding, well, what's the issue here? What's the problem? Okay, well, we want to understand our lake trout biology. Okay, we want to understand our lake trout biology. Here's our current distribution. It's really, those of you that are interested in animals, and geez, who's not, right? Fieldguide.mt.gov is a state site managed by the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the state folks. Very, very good, informative site if you're interested in that. But this is distribution, shows our distribution of lake trout here. They also occasionally show up below Kerr Dam. My auntie's here, she thought that I was talking about the river today. So I'm going to mention the river. But these fish have gone they've either been spilled or they've been somehow survived going through the turbines. And lake trout are occasionally picked up in the upper reaches of the river. Now, they're never going to get established because they cannot tolerate cold, warm water. The upper lethal limit for a lake trout is about 73 degrees, and they cannot tolerate warm water, so they'll never get established in the lower river. You have 80-degree water or warmer regularly in the lower river, so it'll just never happen. At any rate, he said with false bravado, it'll never happen.
Bill, 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. So, Lake Trout 101 then. Our distribution map, they're the largest native North American trout. They grow relatively slowly. They exhibit delayed sexual maturity. They don't like pop out of the egg and start having babies of their own. They also lay a relatively small number of fish, and individual fish generally spawn only every other year. And they're kind of interesting in that they're broadcast spawners. They don't make beds. They don't make the reds and stuff. They sort of spawn in cracks and crevices, and females just kind of go along and lay eggs. And then the males just sort of swim along and fertilize the eggs. They exhibit no parental care whatsoever. And in fact, lake trout often eat their own eggs. And they're a very long-lived fish. The record is 65 years. So all of this adds up to this concept that we try to employ with our students of understanding R and K selected organisms. Our selected organism is like a fly or a mouse or a rabbit. Okay, little stuff, doesn't live very long, has lots of babies. The K selected organisms are the bigger ones, delayed sexual maturity. Our classic example would be something like an elephant or a whale. 20-month, 22-month gestation, years to become sexually mature, one baby at a time, and then have a lot of parental care, and then another baby sometime later. Okay? So this would imply to us that these guys should be vulnerable to overharvest. That they are, as far as fish go, they're relatively slow reproducing fish. And yet, we have been hitting these fish over and over and over, and they're not declining as far as we can tell. This is from Yellowstone. This is part of the concern. The larger fish are piscivorous. The smaller fish, we already know, are eating those little organisms until they're about 2 or 3 years old. They eat those. They hang around in deep water, and because they avoid their larger brethren, because lake trout will eat anything that they can get in their mouth. And anything that they can get in their mouth is about half of their body length. They have this, if you ever catch a lake trout, they're all mouth. They just have these huge mouth, not like a largemouth bass, but their gape is such that they can swallow about a 40% of their body length fish. So you say if it's a 2-foot long fish, it can swallow a fish nearly a foot long. Okay, so this is an example here of the concern. This is a bull trout from Yellowstone Lake. This is a couple of Yellowstone cutthroats that they pulled out of it. I took one of my friends, my student actually now, but he was my little buddy back in those days. I took him fishing, and he caught a lake trout, and in its mouth, just down in its throat, you could see the tail of a fish sticking out. And he could not wait till we got back to shore, and first thing he did was cut it open so he could see what the fish was inside of it. So piscivorous fish, they eat other fish. They eat their own kind even, but they're very voracious predators. So what about bull trout then? Bull trout is a big reason why we want to try to reduce the lake trout population. They're classified as a threatened species. They're kind of like aquatic grizzly bears. They require clean, clear, cold, connected habitat. They're also large. They grow to 25 pounds or better in the lake. Very attractive fish. It's also possible to confuse lake trout and bull trout, and there's a bull trout ID page. I encourage you to go to this if you want to go right out there and catch lake trout and do your part. Be sure that you know what a lake trout is. You can confuse them with bull trout. And there's a bull trout ID program. It's really nice. You get a little education. You can do the test. You get a little certificate at the end. It's just like the online ethics class at the University of Montana. So you can learn to identify a bull trout. It is possible to confuse a bull trout and a lake trout. So basically, if there's no black on the dorsal fin, put it back. No black, put it back. It's very simple. So this innovative approach that I wanted to spend a few minutes on is Mack Days. This is one of my students and her little baby and her boyfriend. This is a tagged fish that he caught, $500 fish. He was pretty happy about that. So this is, again, my tip of the hat to Buddy for coming up with the fish trap days. And then there's certainly some evidence that it stimulated angler interest. And how they did that was basically by saying it doesn't matter how good of a fisherman you are, it's luck of the draw. You get a ticket for each fish, and then we have a drawing, and obviously the more fish you catch, the better chance you have of winning. But it was just a lottery system, and again, there was a lot of interest. Particularly one year, they had like a $30,000 tag or something like that. It was some huge number anyway, and everybody was all excited about it. Oh my God, what if we caught that fish? But they put tagged fish out there for a couple of reasons. One of them was to add some sort of drama to the event, but another one was sort of this stealth kind of mark and recapture thing to get a better handle on the population. So that's one of the things that we did. And certainly, did it increase angler interest? Absolutely. This is the trend from 2003 spring up to the most recent event. We see a trend in increasing numbers of anglers participating, and we also see an increase in harvest numbers. The spring event in 2010 was phenomenal. 30-some thousand fish were harvested. 34,000 fish were harvested in the spring Mack Days. One kid that you probably have heard of, Stephen Nathy, caught more fish by himself than were caught in the entire first year's event, the Fish Trap Days. He caught more fish in that one event by himself than were caught during the entire contest in the first Fish Trap Days. But is it working? The question is it working? Why not, just kill them all and let God sort them out? Well, one thing we do know from the data is that the native fish species populations that we're concerned about do seem to be relatively stable. What they're seeing is if they put more money into the event, which they've been doing every year, they used to charge us, now they don't charge us anymore, so that more and more people can get in the event for free. It does result in more people fishing. I went and bought a boat. I wouldn't even fish Flathead Lake if it wasn't for these tournaments. I'm not interested in catching lake trout. I'm just interested in, I like to fish. And I would not even do that if it wasn't for this tournament. And they gave me my numbers. I've caught 1,455 fish, I think, in the tournament, which sounds like a lot. But I think, is Roger here? Roger Diltz, are you here anywhere? Roger caught, 900 in the last one, didn't he? Or some ungodly number like that. I took him out when he got here and showed him how to fish. That's a true story. And he learned really well. He has a PhD, Now, there is some anecdotal evidence that some of these fishermen are suggesting, by God, we used to go out and catch 100 all the time. We can't even do that anymore. I understand that. I hear that. But I also know that the fisheries biologists are saying we set the same gill nets all the time in the same places. We still catch the same number of fish. We're not seeing a decline in the population yet. They've set a goal that they think they need to get to. They think they need to get 60,000 fish every year in order to achieve a more balanced fishery. That's what they think they need to do. And what they want to do is they want to combine both the recreational angling, which they have estimates for, with the two Mack Days events, which they have hard data for. And if they can get to 60,000 that way, they figure they can stabilize the population at least and bring a more balanced fishery back to the lake. A lot of people don't understand. We still can't keep a fish that's over 36 inches. We can keep one fish over 36 inches. We can't keep any fish tribal members can keep anything they want. You can't keep any fish for the contest and turn them in that are between 30 and 36 inches. So it's called a slot limit. And a lot of people say, I don't understand that. Those big fish, don't they eat a lot of fish and don't they make a lot of eggs? Yes, they do. But the bottom line is it's a compromise. It's a compromise position. These are $1997. $16 million was contributed to the local economy by lake trout fishermen. That was the estimate that was made. I don't know, I don't know about methodology or economics or whatever, but that's what they said. And when they developed the report for the first 10-year plan, was that lake trout angling was a significant component of the economy. And these are big fish. They're attractive. The state record came from Flathead Lake in 2004. A lady that was like 73 years old caught a 42-pound lake trout. It was crazy. I've tried to get a picture of it. I couldn't find a picture. I know they're out there. But so this is the place where, a person would have a chance to set the state record for a lake trout. And so it is very, very attractive to people. We have the sporting goods stores, Zimmer Tackle, practically, I would imagine the main part of their business is lake trout fishermen. So it is very important to the local economy. In terms of future directions, well, they're probably going to continue this process. They're going to continue to monitor the fish populations. And certainly where SKC can play a role in this, I think, is in terms of any kind of fish research, invertebrate research, and particularly some of the other species that we haven't even talked about. And there's zebra mussels have been getting a lot of play lately. Flowering rush is one that I know Virgil Dupuis is very concerned about, as well as zebra mussels and any other aquatic invasives. Yet another example of if something else were to be introduced intentionally or accidentally to the lake, what kinds of problems would potentially result from that. So those are some of my references if you're interested, and that is that.
We know there are people who have classes at 1. Feel free to leave. Professor Swaney will entertain questions. Professor Stevens?
Bill,
Yes.
You showed this big population of whitefish. Yeah, that was news to me. Nobody's mentioned that to me in my work with lake trout. Are they a problem?
It's hard to say. Whitefish are. They have little tiny mouths, so they eat little fish, and they're primarily tied to another introduced species, which is perch. But they're also exploiting that mysis population, so they've gained a competitive advantage that way. There was some historical evidence that larger whitefish had accumulations of PCBs, and they didn't know where those were coming from. So consumption of those did represent a health risk. Problem with whitefish, again, with their biology is such that they're really only vulnerable to anglers 2 times a year. And one time is right around Veterans Day to about the first of the year when they spawn. And another time is when the schools of perch are about this long and they congregate in the bays, and then the big schools of whitefish come in and pursue them then. So it's otherwise you hardly ever catch one. And so they're not concentrated, and they're another story. I mean, they're really fun to catch and really good to eat. Lake trout are okay to catch and not so okay to eat, but in terms of quality, I mean, smaller lake trout are pretty good, the ones that are mostly eating mysis. They're nice and pink.
Even though they're a large population, their impact on the bull trout and cutthroat is less than the smaller sized lake trout.
Yes, that's true. Frank?
I understand that since 1977, the overall temperature of the lake has increased 2 degrees. So why don't we just wait until it gets to 75 and everything will be hunky-dory?
Up with climate change. Yes, that's very true. Yeah, potentially would be. Of course, the deeper water regions of the lake are always going to have a fairly cold temperature. So, at least in our lifetime, hopefully the lake will still be oligotrophic. We can say that much. Virgil.
Well, the $16 million figure kind of surprised me. Given that it's such a valuable fishery, do you have any comments on why there's a strong propensity to not charge the fishermen for things like the privilege to fish, and not charge the fishermen for things like food web research, things that contribute to this $16 million economy? Wash stations, those sort of things. There's really a hard time funding those kind of things that would help protect this $16 million a year resource.
Oh, most definitely. I think that, for example, you go to Desiree's here. We go up to Blackfeet country, and you pay $65 to fish. I pay $65, I think, to fish there. We don't charge anything like that here. And in fact, what we're doing is non-members, if they just want to fish the south half of the lake, they're only charged a $10 a year permit if they just want to fish the south half of the lake. Now, certainly, incentives like that, for example, if you go to fish Fort Peck, you have to pay for a warm water stamp, what they call a warm water stamp. And they have a huge hatchery over at Fort Peck that they stock Chinook salmon and walleye in Fort Peck. And part of the licensing fee goes to support that hatchery effort. So that's certainly a legitimate question. As far as those kinds of incentives, yeah, I 100% agree that's something that ought to be looked at in terms of, a whole economic study could be done on sort of willingness to pay. How much would we be willing to pay to keep aquatic invasives out of the lake? If we had to pay for a wash station for boats to ensure that, to lessen the chance that zebra mussels could invade the lake, what would we be willing to pay? I mean, that's a legitimate question.
We were trying to work on a $10 per boat charge to fund aquatic invasive species prevention. Strongly opposed by the sportsman's group. One particular sportsman said he had 3 boats worth $75,000 each, and he couldn't afford it.
He couldn't afford it. Yes, Tracy.
What about the sturgeons? What do you know about the sturgeons?
Well, there were sturgeon in Kootenai River, and they're trying to bring them back. They're another species that used to run clear up and down to Columbia up into this country, but with all of the dams and the breaking of connectivity, I mean, like I said, my understanding was always that there were sturgeon in the lake, but I can't find any mention in the management plans. They specifically say we had 10 native species, and they listed them. Sturgeon were not in there.
Is that because maybe they weren't there all the time? They just sort of passed through?
It's very, very possible.
They're still there.
Some people say that the Flathead monster would be a sturgeon, is probably a sturgeon. Those fish can live 150 years. The Cur Dam closed in 38. Really from 1930 on, I don't think anything could have got up there, but yeah, it's possible. Certainly possible, but I don't know. I know there's a guy who claims that he hooked one in the lower river. Yes, Jay.
Before Cur Dam was inserted, the flat design was a pretty serious waterfall. Did the fish go up and down that fall pretty easily, or was there a problem with that?
I would guess that it was a pretty significant barrier. It would probably take a pretty serious fish to get through that. One of the things I haven't really seen much of is historic photos of the site where the dam is now, because I know when I take people there, I try to envision what it was like without the dam. But it was a pretty significant waterfall, which is how we named the resort. So
Same place as Falling Waters.
yeah.